The economic center of gravity is shifting, away from the north, away from the west. New centers of wealth are emerging and grow stronger by the day. Latin America, the Middle East, Russia and of course Asia are true power brokers. On financial markets, traditional institutions are being outmaneuvered by a new generation of investors and innovators. Now, CNBC brings together regulators, politicians, investors and industry leaders to address the question, who is in charge and who is protecting the world from systemic risk on financial markets?
We're not going to solve this with new sheriffs or old sheriffs.
Alan Greenspan became famous because nobody could understand what he said.
We were here last year. Did anyone mention the word subprime?
The central banks lost control by allowing the financial institutions to run amok.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator, CNBC's Maria Bartiromo.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us here at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. And to those of you watching at home, welcome. As you have heard, we have brought you all together today to debate the leadership challenges against a backdrop of shifting power dynamics and economic uncertainty. We have here today many respected authorities from the world of finance, regulation, and politics. They will be arguing for and against motions that approach these issues from different angles. And you guys on the floor, you are critical. We need your votes, but most importantly, we need your opinions. Here's a refresher on the rules. There are 3 motions to be debated. One panelist from each side gets a maximum of 4 minutes to argue for or against each motion. Once the 2 speakers are done, we will take speeches from the floor. That's your chance to put your views across. Let's outline motion 1. Central banks are expected to act as the guardians of economic stability. But did the events of 2007 reveal that their authority is under threat? I invite Professor Joseph Stiglitz to debate for the motion that central bankers have lost their focus and control with respect to economic governance.
Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize-winning economist and professor at Columbia University.
Well, first let me begin by talking about what they should be focusing on. And I think the mandate of the Fed in the United States is the right mandate. It's growth, employment, and inflation. Inflation is only one of the 3 objectives. The problem is it's focused too narrowly on inflation, worse in Europe, where they focused only on inflation. And now we see the consequences. They clearly made bad judgments. The Fed has finally imposed some regulations on the predatory lending, the subprime mortgages that banks lent money beyond their ability to pay. It looked the other way when the when the investment banks were packaging together these complex products in a non-transparent way. The underlying problems, that there were underlying problems, was foreseeable. And a number of people at the meeting last year talked about it. There was a housing bubble. It was hard to believe it wasn't. While the people at the bottom's real income was falling, median income in the United States has been falling, there was no way that they could afford to pay these more and more in their mortgages. Especially, many of these mortgages had these complicated reset provisions. The Fed at one point went so far as to encourage people to take out these variable rate mortgages, saying that they would have been better off if they had taken out these variable rate mortgages. But that encouragement occurred when the interest rates were at the very bottom. There was only one way those interest rates could go, when that was up. And as those interest rates went up, more and more people would find the mortgages beyond their ability to pay. So what we have now is the foreseeable consequences of bad economic management. We could trace the problems back to the tax cuts in 2001, where the chairman of the Fed encouraged those tax cuts. They were not designed to stimulate the economy, and they did so only to a little extent, and that put the burden of keeping the American economy going on fiscal policy. But then with the war leading to soaring oil prices, diverting expenditures to areas that did not provide much stimulation, the economy was fundamentally weak. And the only way that we got through this difficult period was for Americans to consume and consume. Savings rate went down to zero for the first time since the Great Depression. So these are the fundamental problems facing the American economy. The Fed did nothing about it. It has now taken actions. Too late. It takes 6 months to 18 months for the effective interest rates to take effect. Keynes talked about when economy is weak, monetary policy is like pushing on a string. It's good for restraining an economy where there's excess, but not when there's a problem like those today.
Professor, you have a few more minutes. What you're saying is that the Fed was more focused on inflation as opposed to regulatory issues in terms of allowing all of that free lending.
That's right. To some extent, it could have argued that it didn't have the instruments to do that. If it had raised interest rates, the economy would have been weaker and could not have continued. It didn't want to break up the party of the bubble, just like in the 90s when there's a tech bubble. But the fact is, it didn't stay silent. The chairman of the Fed talked about there being a little froth, but did not discourage people, did not bring out the problems in the way that they should have.
Professor Stiglitz, thank you. I now invite Secretary John Snow to speak against the motion that central bankers have lost their focus and control with respect to economic governance.
Secretary John Snow, Chairman of Cerberus Capital Management.
Good, thank you. You know, one of the great principles of American government is that the Treasury and the executive branch recognizes the independence of the Fed. And that's scrupulously observed. So I find it interesting today that I'm on this side of this debate. But the fact of the matter is, when you ask the question, does the Fed, do central banks continue to be relevant to the governance of the global economy? Are they out of ammunition? Are they incompetent to deal with the issues they face? Oh, I think the answer there has clearly be no. Central banks remain at the center. And central banks, over the last 20 years or so, and we have some central bank governors here who can talk to this better than I can. I'm looking at one. The performance of central banks is really pretty remarkable. Interesting that they would be in the box now. Because for a 20-year period, we've seen these institutions of the global economy perform as well as or better than any others. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about something called the Great Moderation. I think all the economists in the room would agree that because of better monetary policy, because the tools of monetary policy have been honed, things like the Taylor Rule, named after John Taylor, who served with me in the Treasury Department and now is at Stanford, but others, and a whole body of literature that has played out the use of these tools more effectively. What have we seen for the last 20 years? Maria, you're too young to remember 18% inflation rates, but we had them. Inflation has been largely tamed. Inflationary expectations have been largely tamed. And the variability of output and inflation has come down, really cut by about 50%. So the Fed and the other central banks with which they coordinate, who all know the Taylor Rule, who all look at the world in terms of these new tools that have come out of monetary policy, apply them effectively, and we are in a fundamentally stronger position today in the global economy because of the performance of the central banks. Now, central banks aren't perfect. They don't have perfect insight. They can't foresee the world ahead perfectly, but who can? I mean, if I'm here today to defend the perfect foresight of the Fed, I'm going to lose this debate. But I'm going to lose it if I'm talking about any other institutions of the United States government. We have to recognize the limitations of forecasting. They're implicit in doing monetary policy. But has the Fed and the other central banks been asleep at the switch? No. When the problem began to manifest itself last August in its fuller dimensions, we saw the Fed act. We saw the ECB act. We saw the Bank of England act. Was it too measured? Well, maybe. Could they have done more? Well, maybe. But did they act? I think the issue of whether our central banks are capable of vigorous action, bold action, was answered yesterday. And as to the question whether the central banks have lacked focus, have lost focus, let me say I think they're on the march, they're on the watch, and that their performance will result in, if we have a recession, a short and shallow recession at most. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Snow. Of course, the market events with the major averages, whether it be the Nikkei or the Dow Jones Industrial Average, down between 8 and 20% just in 2008, this question becomes quite relevant. You've heard what our speakers have to say. Now it's your turn. Jacob Frankel?
I think that we should not get into the game of giving grades now to central bank activities, but rather talk about, as Yusuf indicated, has the system changed to such an extent that central bankers and central banks become relatively irrelevant and impotent? And I believe absolutely not. Central banks are the only agency in policy-making bodies that are responsible for providing price stability. It is also, therefore, the only agency that provides the sine qua non for growth. There is no trade-off between price stability and growth. Price stability is the conditions that would produce growth. We were here last year. Did anyone mention the word subprime? The answer is no. And I was on the panel here.
That's not true.
Excuse me. I'm glad that you took my time. But
we will come back to you, Professor
I
Stiglitz.
was with Rubini together on that panel, and the point of the matter is that indeed the issue was not whether subprime was mentioned or not, but rather, do we have and did we have a financial system that was conducive for the emergence of such irresponsible situations in which teaser rates were given, no documentation mortgages were given, rating agencies are paid by the issuers and not by the investors. Those are the issues that provided the wrong incentives. The Fed is seeing the picture. The Fed lowered interest rate in an extraordinary, dramatic way. The pilot of this plane has his eyes on the ball. He is willing to take dramatic actions if needed to affect both liquidity of markets and psychology and expectations. Psychology and expectations are very active policy measure. It's not a reactive one.
The question of accountability as far as the housing crisis remains. Larry Summers.
I think John Snow's right that the record over the last 25 years has been an impressive one, and it has manifested itself in low volatility. I think it's hard to give central banks a very high grade over the last couple of years on recognition of incipient bubbles and action taken to address them in either the regulatory or the policy sphere. And I think it's hard to give a high grade for what's happened in the last 6 months as the bubbles were bursting when they've been consistently behind the curve. And what has been sorely lacking in our globalized world has been an adequate sense of international coordination with respect to the monetary policy response.
Which is something that George Soros wants to address.
I think that the central banks have lost control of the situation when they allowed the financial institutions to develop various new financial instruments, new techniques of spreading risks, securitization, and so on, which they themselves could not understand the risks involved. So the central banks lost control by allowing the financial institutions to run amok.
So you're agreeing with Professor Stiglitz then?
Of course.
Dr. Gowles.
We are talking about policy mistakes. Poor performance in the last 2 years, I agree with Larry. Great performance over the last 25 years. But is there anything systemically that makes these central bankers less controlling of the world economy? They don't coordinate with each other, fine. But should you get the right policies today, you will get proper control of central banks, of the governance. So the issue is nothing has changed in our system, or at least that's what I hear being said, that forbids central bankers from being in control should they get the right policies. We're talking policy mistakes. We're not talking systemic weaknesses, systemic changes that impede this.
Sir, you have the final word, and then we'll get back to the speakers on the stage.
Yeah, I agree that central banks are still effective, but there's been a systemic change in the financial system that is the emergence of non-bank financial institutions, what the folks at PIMCO refers as a shadow banking system, that have the characteristics of borrowing short and in liquid terms and investing and lending long in liquid ways. And these institutions, whether they're money market funds or sieves or conduits or investment banks or hedge funds or others, have the characteristic they don't have access to the central bank lender of last resort support. And once you have a liquid and a credit crunch, the transmission mechanism of monetary policy to the non-bank financial system is interrupted. And that's a significant change. And in a world in which you have more asset bubbles that affect financial markets and real economy and the existence of these non-banking players, then it's much more difficult to do monetary policy. I think that's a systemic difference.
Thank you for that. All very, very important points. Our two speakers now have 30 seconds each to respond to some of the points made in the audience. Professor Stiglitz, you first.
Okay, first, I think Nouriel is exactly right. There have been systemic changes, and to pretend there haven't is just wrong. The other point is that we've been giving credit to the central bank for other things going on in the global economy. One of the reasons that the world has seen low inflation in the last 15 years is China. China has been exporting its low prices, its deflationary pressures, just like the United States has been exporting its toxic mortgages. And we shouldn't necessarily give credit to the central banks or central bankers for being in office at the right time.
Secretary Snow, you have 30 seconds.
Yeah, two points. Should central banks pierce bubbles? I think it's a dangerous course. It's easy to see a bubble from the rearview mirror. It's awful hard to see a bubble when you're in the middle of it. We could certainly pierce bubbles. They've got the power to do it. But they'd pierce a lot of non-bubbles, too, and take a lot out of GDP. That's a risk of that approach. Secondly, on the central bank's role with respect to subprime and with respect to all this exotic paper that's out there, their primary function is not a regulatory one. As I understand it, the ECB doesn't have a regulatory. It's the national banks.
Which is what Mr. Stiglitz is saying, the opposite. He's saying they do have a regulatory role.
No, well, and it's a secondary role for the Fed. It's shared with any number of other institutions, OCC, OTS, FDIC, and the state regulators. Maria, I think what we need to do is reform regulation. We don't have in the United States one overview of our financial markets, and we should have it, and we should coordinate among all those agencies or create a central coordinated point.
We'll look forward to motion 3 on that subject for sure. Time to vote on motion 1. Now we get the brilliance of all of you. Pick up your voting consoles. Press yes if you wish to vote for the motion. Central bankers have lost their focus and control with respect to economic governance. Press no to vote against the motion. We'll bring you more lively debate right after this break. Welcome back, everyone, to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, where we are asking, who's in charge? We have just debated the motion that central bankers have lost their focus and control with respect to economic governance. Let's see what our audience thought of the proposition. 59% agree central bankers have lost their focus and control with respect to economic governance, a majority in our audience, while 41% voted against. Thank you all for that. Blue chip financial institutions in the United States and Europe have been the pioneers of capitalism. But are they now losing ground? I invite Mr. Ibrahim Dabdoub to argue for the motion that new stakeholders such as sovereign wealth funds, hedge and private equity funds have become the new power brokers.
Ibrahim Dabdoub, CEO of the National Bank of Kuwait.
Thank you very much, Maria. Today I'll be talking about the 4 new power brokers, as they call them, but most importantly about the sovereign wealth funds, the SWFs, because I belong to a country where the sovereign wealth fund is an important issue. These 4 power brokers, these 4 players, at the moment, we think that they wield control over an asset base of at least in the region of $8 trillion. And within the next 5 years, we believe that they will reach something like anywhere between 15 to 20 trillion dollars. That's a lot of money. Even for Kuwait. The SWFs, namely Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, the ADIA, which we believe has funds in the region of anywhere between 500 billion to 600 billion, and the KIA, where I belong to, Kuwait Investment Authority, anywhere between 200 to 250 billion dollars. And then all the others, like Qatar Investment Authority, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Norway, you name it. We believe that these SWFs have, at the moment, could add up altogether something like $3 trillion. And they are increasing in size very, very rapidly. As a matter of fact, the oil-producing countries, and most notably the GCC countries, they are growing so much in size day by day that we believe that their annual growth rate would have bought all the $460 billion of bonds issued by the US and Europe last year, in the year 2006, and still have around $700 billion to invest in other assets. So you can imagine the size. As a matter of fact, there is a joke now in the UAE that ADIA, which had made some investments in Citibank, could have made the investment in Citibank, which is around $5 billion, with the revenues of 15 to 20 days of oil. That's a joke, but it's still serious. We believe that the rise now, the power brokers, and most importantly the SWFs, is seen as a structural shift in global financial markets. It's really a structural shift. And it is really a shift that signals a shift in power and wealth from the United States and Europe to the other parts of the world. We have already seen some of the effects that those players have had on the financial and capital markets. They have increased liquidity. We think that they have reduced interest rates by at least 75 basis points and still going. These new players will usher in more investments in Asia and other parts of the world to diversify their investments, and I think this will also bring in some very interesting arrangements. Now, there are some fears that the investors in these funds will have more political clout in the future. The problem is we in the GCC, in the Arab world, we are being blamed for everything, not only because we messed up the ozone layer by our carbon emissions, but now because we have more money, and it's really pathetic. The GCC SWFs, the sovereign wealth funds, they are not political players. They are financial players, and the stability of the global economies is very important because such funds are basically a way of securing diversified funds when the importance of oil declines in the future.
Mr. Dabdoub, all very good points. We appreciate it. Thank you so much. I now invite Mr. Angel Gurría to speak against the motion that new stakeholders, such as sovereign wealth hedge funds and private equity funds, have become the new power brokers.
Angel Gurría, Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
I disagree, but only about the fact that they're power brokers. They are powers. But I disagree with our reaction to the sovereign wealth funds. Already we have enough protectionism on trade. Already we have enough protectionism of investments. And now we're adding protectionism against these sovereign wealth funds with absolutely no evidence that they've done anything wrong, at least so far. But if we can't beat them, why try? And then why try at all to beat them? They are players. We should incorporate them. We may not be in agreement with the origin of the accumulation. Some monetary policy of some kind, some trade policy of another, $100 barrels, we may not like that, but we have to deal with the accumulation, and it's inevitable reality. We have to do the best out of it. Now, size matters in this particular issue. Some of the numbers that were mentioned are important. Yes, but let's put it in context. Even the number in 10 years' time is going to be just a fraction of the overall savings that are being managed by the financial system of the world. They're going to be around this, maybe the size of the pension funds or the insurance companies, etc. So let's put it in context. It is not larger than anything we've been handling so far. And also, let's focus also on the total size of reserves themselves rather than just a particular name for the funds. Or let's focus, I mean, why do people want to do business with Gazprom and don't want to be selling a part of their business to a Russian sovereign fund? You know, it's inconsistent. Now, we've been looking hard at this thing. The OECD is saying, okay, there are two sides. The buyers have to have transparency, they have to market rules, professional management, they have to have the right information to the markets, yes, but the sellers don't overreact, don't overregulate, don't overcontrol, don't overlegislate. Case by case is fine. These are helping investment, they're recycling, they're helping solve some of the problems of the imbalances and the asymmetries. We could think that some of them or part of them could turn them from sovereign wealth funds. Wealth is the wrong word, but they could become sovereign development funds if they dedicate some of their resources to developing emerging markets, not granting aid, but basically channeling risk resources. And then please don't add to these protectionist pressures that exist already. Finally, we are trying to legislate or be very cautious against the fact that they could buy companies in our countries. We're talking about sovereign countries that can do whatever they want to remedy something. This is like that famous definition where they said, no, I can't define it, but if I see it, I know one. Well, this is exactly the case. If there's going to be an abuse or if there's going to be bad practices, we're going to detect them, and countries are still free to resolve the particular issue that may have caused that problem, but don't create a systemic problem when there isn't one. Thank you.
And Mr. Gurría, in your final 20 seconds, you're saying that the sovereign wealth funds should not be challenged because it's protectionist, but they are not the new power brokers.
They are not the new power brokers. They are powers, and they should not be challenged simply because they are owned by governments. They should be challenged in terms of their deeds, not their ownership.
Thank you, Mr. Gurría. So there are the views of our speakers. But what do you all think? First up, Martin Sorrell.
Thank you, Maria. They are the new power brokers. And this is just another natural consequence of the massive shift in economic power that we're seeing to Asia, to Latin America, to Africa and the Middle East and Central and Eastern Europe. And we in the West find that very difficult to accept. It reminds me of the outsourcing debate and the manufacturing debate we had in relation to India and China. We benefited from free trade. We benefited from the lack of protectionism. We cannot moan or groan when India and China express their competitive advantage. The fundamental problem with the SWFs, there are three, I think, that we have to examine. The first is that whether we like it or not, geopolitical relations may suffer as funds potentially seek to implement their domestic goals or their political goals. Secondly, global economic instability can increase if the source of their wealth is threatened, i.e. oil earnings. And market efficiency and corporate governance could suffer if the SWFs continue to accept, for example, non-voting participation in their investments and focus on strategic investments rather than those with the highest returns. So those three issues, I think, have to be dealt with in a constructive way, and there has to be some code of conduct that will have to be implemented in time.
Let me throw out a point. I think it was Angela Merkel in Germany who said Germany did not privatize industries just to get them taken over by other governments. Fred Bergston.
I think the sovereign wealth funds are both powers and power brokers. And we should think of them in the recycling context. They are the owners of a huge amount of the surplus funds in both Asia and the oil exporting countries, and they're making crucial decisions where to recycle that money. When we had a big recycling issue in the 1970s, the recycling of funds went through the commercial banks. Now they are going in some part to the commercial banks to rescue the commercial banks from the shortcomings of their bad lending practices in recent years. And that means the decisions of the sovereign wealth funds will go far to determine which banks are recapitalized and survived, and those which are not recapitalized and may even fail or have deep difficulty.
Interesting things there, Fred. Larry Summers.
One has to have some caution about named specific stakes that could ultimately lead towards control taken by governments. Is it going to be a matter of political indifference treated entirely in a financial way if a bank that has sold substantial preferred stock to a foreign government gets in trouble? Or is that going to become a matter of negotiation between the two governments?
Thank you, Larry. Yes, Professor Stiglitz.
Well, I want to come back to the point that was made before, that it's the practices that we need to worry about. If we have good antitrust laws, if they want to buy a pencil company and then they want to give away the pencils, do we care? On the other hand, if we don't have good antitrust policies, if we don't have good laws dealing with regulation, then we need to be worried. But we need to be worried whether it's a sovereign fund, a non-transparent hedge fund, or any other private investor. So it seems to me we ought to be focusing on the inadequacy of our regulatory structures. And I think that is a source of concern. And I think that's the good thing about this debate. It's highlighted that we don't think we have confidence in the way our economic system is working.
So you're not differentiating whether it's government or not. Mr. Dabdoub, we're going to come right back to you. Let's get to union leader Philip Jennings in the audience, see what he has to say.
Millions of workers around this world now depend for their livelihoods on the investment decisions of sovereign wealth funds, private equity, and hedge funds. When a hedge fund takes a 1%, 2% stake in an enterprise which employs 200,000 people and starts talking very publicly about the problems that they perceive that company has, this creates great instability, great fragility, and we've seen an abuse of power in those situations. Therefore, there are global standards in place, and my appeal here would be to private equity, to hedge funds, and to sovereign wealth funds, comply with those standards and engage with the labor movement in a process as to how you exercise your power. You'll make better decisions.
Thank you very much. Our two speakers now have 30 seconds each to respond to some of the points made in the audience.
I think those fears are really unfounded. I mean, I can talk again about the sovereign wealth funds. And I'm not a politician, really, but apart from China, all these countries are small countries, and it's not in their best interest, really, to make any problem with the government's recipient. And I remember very much the backlash back in the 70s, I think, when Japan wanted to buy the Rockefeller Center.
Right.
I mean, it's really unfounded. There is a saying by Sheikh Zayed, the late Sheikh Zayed in Abu Dhabi. He was saying, you know, at that time, they told him the Kuwaitis are buying our property and our real estate. And he said, yes, I can understand that. But when you find the Kuwaiti tying a rope to the building and pulling it to Kuwait, come and tell me. Come and tell me. This is really dumbfounded. We are so dependent on the dollar. We are so dependent on the euro. We are so dependent on the stability of the economies. This is where we put our money because these are our savings. And I don't think these countries want any trouble. I can assure you.
Mr. Gurría, you have 30 seconds.
What Larry Summers said not only sounds, but is reasonable in the sense of saying, beware, you know, let's avoid abuses, and what Joe Stiglitz said about keeping the regulatory environment in each of the recipient countries such that it will receive gladly this very needed infusion of capital. It will complement its domestic savings because it's going to be all right. It's going to land in a good field. It's going to grow and prosper.
Thank you, Mr. Gurría. Thank you so much, Mr. Dabdoub. Time to vote on motion 2. Pick up your voting consoles. Press yes if you wish to vote for the motion that new stakeholders such as sovereign wealth funds, hedge and private equity funds have become the new power brokers. Press no to vote against the motion. We'll bring you the results after this break. Welcome back, everyone, to our debate where we are looking at how traditional authorities are coping with new challenges. And we're asking today, who's in charge? Mr. Ibrahim Dabdoub has argued that new stakeholders such as sovereign wealth funds, hedge funds, and private equity funds have become the new power brokers. Mr. Angel Gurría disagreed. What did the studio audience think? Let's find out. A majority, 81% of you in the audience said new stakeholders such as sovereign wealth, hedge, and private equity funds have become the new power brokers. Just 19% arguing against that motion. Interconnected global markets have brought new prosperity, but are local regulators able to keep up with the new risks? I invite Mr. George Soros to debate for the motion. We need a new sheriff to police global financial markets.
George Soros, Chairman of Soros Fund Management.
I think that all of us agree that financial markets do need a sheriff, that left to their own devices, they go to excesses of euphoria and despair. And that's how central banking has developed, and that's how the regulatory system has evolved. And banking, the provision of credit, used to be an extremely regulated industry. I remember in 1972, I wrote a recommendation, the case for growth banks, that they are going to come alive. At the time, most of them stocks were not even listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And they were extremely stodgy. They never moved. The people in the industry were extremely stodgy, very risk averse. Then things started loosening up. Starting in the 1980s, you had the belief in the magic of the marketplace with Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And the authorities were so successful that they started to believe in this, what I call market fundamentalism, that markets will actually take care of themselves if you only leave them well enough alone. And that has gone too far, because markets did get into trouble, and whenever the financial system itself became threatened, they did intervene, they suspended the rules, and they bailed out the banks that got into difficulty. And that created an asymmetric incentive system, which is recognized as the moral hazard, that allowed the continuing expansion of credit. And globalization allowed the United States, with being the main reserve currency, to suck up the savings of the world until the United States consumes more than 6% more than it produces. So the financial institutions went to town and invented all kinds of new synthetic instruments, created AAA assets where AAA liabilities where there weren't even AAA assets to support them. And the rating agencies also took the calculations of those who created those instruments, accepted them, and put the seal of good housekeeping on it. And that's how the present situation has evolved. The current crisis is not only the bust that follows the housing boom in the United States. It's basically the end of a 60-year period of continuing credit expansion based on the dollar as the reserve currency. Now the rest of the world is increasingly unwilling to accumulate dollars, and the credit expansion can't go any further than providing 100% credit on, with no questions asked, no money down, on assets that are themselves inflated because of the willingness to provide credit. So I think the present crisis is the end of an era based on the dollar as the international currency, and we need a sheriff. We need a new sheriff, not the Washington consensus.
Thank you, George Soros. I invite now Mr. Nandan Nilekani to speak against the motion that we need a new sheriff to police global markets.
Nandan Nilekani, Executive Co-Chairman of Infosys Technologies.
Thank you, Maria. I think the idea of having a global sheriff for policing global financial markets is completely impractical, because any act of creating a global sheriff will require national interest to be subordinated to a global interest. As we heard earlier, the role of the executive and the role of the central bank is to promote growth, employment, and low inflation. And those are things that only national governments can do. If they feel that an economy needs a fiscal stimulus, they will give you rebates. If they feel that it needs more liquidity, the central banks will cut interest rates. If on the other hand, if the central banks feel the economy is overheating, then they will raise interest rates. These are all national decisions taken by national executives and cannot be put under a global sheriff. Can you imagine if on Friday the president had called up this global sheriff and asked him for permission for a fiscal stimulus? Or if on Monday the central bank had called up this global sheriff and asked him whether he can cut interest rates? So I think the notion of a global sheriff is completely impractical in this day and age. The second thing is that a lot of the things are really related to national issues. I mean, for example, the whole crisis we have today, the subprime and all the complex products that George talked about, is essentially a domestic crisis which is getting exported through globalization. So it's highly unlikely that a global sheriff is really going to be able to control these kind of activities, because it's coming out of some kind of a national activity. And therefore, I think it is both impractical because national governments will not allow the powers that you really need for a global sheriff, and because many of the actions that make these crises happen within the country, and only then they get exported out. The third thing I think which goes against having a global sheriff is that the world is becoming much more complex. The many new players we talked about sovereign wealth funds, we talked about new countries that are growing rapidly, and unless you really create a solution that looks at the new complexity of the world, it's only then that we can really think of an effective way of dealing with this at an international level. The other point is, let's look at all the other international attempts for coordination today and where they stand. Today, the United Nations is often a bystander on geopolitical issues. The Security Council is still structured with members from 60 years ago. The G8 is still not ready to expand its membership to include the new countries. The World Bank is finding that its capital flows are dwarfed by private capital and is trying to find a new role in this world. The IMF voting patterns are based on 60-year-old rules. The Doha round of trade discussions have been going on for the last 10 years. And if you look at what's happening in environment, at Kyoto, the 96 protocol has still not been signed by many countries. So when you look at every dimension of global coordination, you find that there is not enough coordination happening and things are just falling apart. And if we cannot get our act together on geopolitics, if we cannot get our act together on trade, if we cannot get our act together on environment, how can we get our act together in creating one global sheriff who's going to make sure that everything works? So I think this whole notion of a global sheriff is impractical, it's irrelevant, and it's implausible. If you really want to create better coordination, we have to recognize there are new powers in new economic countries, there are new powers in these wealth funds. We need to create a pattern of global collaboration in the spirit of what we're doing at Davos this year. We really need to do a completely different model of getting all these people together to really look at how we can solve these problems together. And the solution is not to appoint one guy called the sheriff, because I'm afraid this sheriff will be the one who can't shoot straight. Thank you very much.
Nandan, Nilekani, don't go away. The audience has a say in this, and we will get to the audience next. We'll have plenty of time for some more lively debate from the floor straight after this break. Welcome back to the final part of our debate, where we are asking, who's in charge? You've heard what our speakers have to say. Now it's your turn. And we begin with Martin San.
Thank you, Maria. I think there's a real risk at this point of time that we are overreacting given the market situation we have. The goal of a sound regulatory framework must be to protect the consumer and to obviously build a base for a certain stability, base stability in the financial markets. Regulation must be driven by the markets and must as well respond to the tremendous innovation which is taking place at this point of time. The last 5 years we had more products being developed than the 50 years before. So I think the way forward and the right approach in regulation is to set the principle-based construction, set a principle-based framework in place, which still must have rules though, but these rules must continuously adapt to the market because the market will keep changing, and that's key in order to respond to it.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, Mr. Sahang.
We are facing such an interesting times where up till now we tried to save the stability of the financial system from the inefficiencies and the wrongdoings of the emerging market economies. But now we are seeing that the problems are arising from the developed world. So needing a new sheriff or not is not the real thing. How that sheriff's organization should be made up, that's the problem. My suggestion is for the stability of the world is very much that the fair representation in this organization is a must. All the countries around the world should be represented in these organizations in a more fair way. I don't want to get into the names of today's organizations.
Like the G7?
No, like IMF. I think there can be a more fair representation in IMF. And surveillance and enhanced transparency can only be successful through this fair treatment. That's what I think.
Thank you. Get right to you, Larry Summers.
Look, let's be frank. George Soros is right that there does need to be somebody and some set of authorities doing what hasn't been done as this crisis has gathered for 6 months, which is providing a coherent explanation of its causes and implementing a comprehensive plan, not fiscal stimulus one day, monetary stimulus the next. That hasn't come in the face of a very serious situation. I think it would be very unlikely to come from any kind of newly appointed global sheriff operating on the basis of global consensus. I think the problem is that we've got a set of people in jobs that come with substantial sheriff responsibility, and for a whole variety of reasons, they've been averting their gaze.
Mr. Butchers-Ghali.
The notion of a single sheriff is ludicrous. I agree with Mr. Nilekani. What we need is a system where everybody consults with everybody. But then our markets are so open on each other, are so interrelated, that everybody has to chip in. It's a bit like a movie house. Unless we all sit down, none of us can sit down. If one of us decides not to sit down, we will have to watch the movie standing up. And therefore, we need to have a system where everybody buys in. If we are looking at the IMF, I agree with Larry, look at what is happening now at the change of quotas. We are talking about a 3% shift from developed to developing countries, and they're killing each other on the board. And so I think we need a system. I think we don't have an answer for that system. We don't have a mechanism, and I think we're going to run into problems soon.
Mr. Gurría.
At the OECD, the sheriffs meet 4 times a year. At the IMF, they meet twice a year. At the BIS, they meet every month. You know, they're always meeting. They're always talking to each other. The same guys, Mr. Carney and his colleagues all over the world, you know. So it's not for lack of getting together and talking to each other. They communicate with each other perfectly, but they pride themselves in not issuing communiques. Now, twice a year they produce a communique out of Washington, but in the rest of the meetings they don't produce communiques because that's part of the game. Now they need to communicate. They need to go out. They need to tell the people what's going on. In fact, Alan Greenspan became famous because nobody could understand what he said. Oh, you can't run a financial system like that. Now they say, is Mr. Bernanke going to be as Delphic as Mr. Greenspan? And they would measure his success in those terms. That can't be happening, you know. We are not talking to people, we're not communicating to people, we're not sharing information. So I don't think we need a new sheriff. We need, yeah, better coordination, but also a lot better communication from them to the markets.
With the same sheriffs?
Well, the institutions may have to be revamped. Don't invent new institutions, don't invent new bureaucracy. There's the OECD there, you know, it's pretty good.
Yes, sir.
The current crisis demonstrates how great the international spillovers from policy and non-policy are, so we need to have better agreement. The International Monetary Fund has been asleep at the switch. You didn't even have them on the agenda for this debate, who's in charge. They've been asleep at the switch. But who's the IMF? It's the countries that make up the IMF, particularly the most powerful economies. So you need a steering committee of the major economic powers to consult consistently to try to make sure the world economy moves smoothly. Today, there are 3 global economic superpowers: the United States, the European Union or Euroland, and China. You have to have 3 criteria to be a global economic superpower. You have to be big, you have to be dynamic, and you have to be integrated into the world economy. There are only 3, the US, Euroland, China. We need a G3 steering committee. India is not yet integrated sufficiently into the world economy. They're coming. There'll be a G4 in 10 years. But right now, those 3 need to collaborate closely and steer the kind of cooperation to umpire the world economy.
Thank you, Fred. Yes, sir.
I very much agree with George Soros, and actually the problem today, we talk about sheriffs and all of this. Who actually is responsible for today's problems in the financial markets? These are the banks. And why does it come where the banks, or why do we have all these complicated products out there? Because of bonuses. So the greediness of investment bankers, I used to be one, so I was greedy as well. I'm still greedy today, I'm honest. But it is at the end the greediness of the bonuses, and the bonus payments are wrong because they're on a yearly basis. And now we see it, everybody, the whole financial market falls apart because not even chairmen and presidents of banks are able to look after the risks.
We have to get to the rebuttals next. Thank you. Our 2 speakers now have 30 seconds each to respond to some of the points that have been made. Mr. Soros, you first.
First of all, it's not impractical to have a sheriff because we have a sheriff. It's just that they were asleep at the switch. And also, the present system has put the United States in a very privileged position, being the provider of the main reserve currency, and also having basically veto power in the IMF. And the United States has somewhat abused this privilege, has accumulated debts. Those debts are now coming due. There are new powers, and they have to, you need a new order which is more balanced and recognizes their rising influence and power.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nilekani.
Well, I think there's no guarantee that new sheriff will also not be asleep at the switch. So I think the problem is a larger one. we are trying to solve 21st century problems with 20th century ideas, institutions, and instruments. And unless we change our minds and understand that this is a new world which requires a whole new paradigm of institutions, instruments, and thinking, we're not going to solve this with new sheriffs or old sheriffs.
Thank you so much. It is time to hear from the audience. Time to vote on motion 3. Press yes if you wish to vote for the motion that financial markets need a new global sheriff. Press no to vote against the motion. Let's have a look at the results of our motion 3. We need a new sheriff to police global financial markets. 75% are against that motion. 25% say we need a new sheriff. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been such a fantastic audience. Thank you. Our great thanks to such a distinguished panel, our executive panel. Thank you for your brilliant insights. We're coming to you from the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, where we have been asking, who's in charge?